In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Amen. You please be seated. I'd like to focus just on one phrase from the Gospel reading this morning. You took care of me. You took care of me. Today is Christ the King, that we have all this wonderful recognition of in the church and its furnishings today, the end of the season of Pentecost, as you probably know, and then next week will be the beginning of the church year, the coming church year, and that will be Advent 1. So today we have Christ the King, and the Gospel then opens with that phrase, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. When the Son of Man comes, he will sit on the throne of his glory. And here in this Gospel reading today, we have this Son of Man characterized. What is the Son of Man like? What is this kingship of his like? And what his kingship is like is one of compassion. He's enthroned on a throne of compassion. We live in a world which is in many ways not very compassionate at all. At times it's incredibly cruel. To look at the news sometimes in these weeks, it really makes you feel almost sick to your stomach, some of the things that we see described there. And of course some of it is connected with religious fanaticism, let's say in the Middle East, and yet when we look at our own history as Christians, it's hard to point a finger because there have been terrible times in our own history. Perhaps some of the more recent ones being the whole of Europe, fascist Europe at the time of the Second World War. You had Italy, you had Germany, Christian countries, longly established Christian countries, highly educated Christian countries, France, the rest of Europe, Spain, of course. You can't exclude Britain from it, and you can't exclude the United States from it either. The terrible anti-Semitism, for example, that there was there, and the Holocaust, and of course Stalin and his depredations. So we do live in a world that is cruel, and we see the cruelty from time to time around us, and it can be horrifying. I certainly do find it at times horrifying, and as I've said before, hold on to that phrase in the Lord's Prayer, thy kingdom come, because it seems that another kingdom can't come other than God's kingdom to bring peace and justice into our world. But while I was sort of thinking about that, it's as if God was saying, well, there's not only that in the world, John. Just look around and see if you can't think of some of the places in which there's the opposite as well. And indeed there is. And I think it's going to be hard during these weeks and months to forget about the wonderful work, for example, of the Doctors Without Borders, and really hold them up in prayer as they, from all countries, go to West Africa and daily risk their lives for the sake of people they've never met, and of which we may be the beneficiaries too. Health in the rest of the world. Not only doctors, but nurses, health administrators. It's incredible and it's wonderful to watch what they're doing, their kindness, and the way in which they show the grace of God. As our bishop said, it's really probably quite important in our time that we remind those around us that this is what Jesus is speaking about in a passage like this that we have today. That the compassion of Jesus Christ for the world, that is the example that he calls us as Christians to follow. During these last weeks, of course, we've been studying St. Francis and learning about St. Francis, and of the 3 or 4 things that I most kind of take as a lesson from his life that I hope I can try and rise to in my life, but one of them is that very word, compassion. And you remember how he said that he literally hated lepers, that he could hardly bring himself to look at them, even standing on the hill on the other side of the valley, that they disgusted him so much. that he hated the way they smelled, that he says all that. He's as bold and as frank as to say all that. But then when he turned to follow Jesus Christ, the first thing that he did was that he went to a leper to kiss him and embrace him. And that is where he and his first two companions began to build up their ministry, caring, as the Doctors Without Borders are doing today, caring for, living with the lepers and caring for them. So we have, many wonderful examples of people who have been like Christ. When Christ says, if you want to associate yourself with me, you have to associate yourself with my compassion for other people. Those sheep that are going to go onto his right-hand side are people who go and visit other people in jail. And I thought, the amount of repetition in this parable makes it almost hard to read if you think about it. It's repeated again and again and again in the writing here. What he said to the one group: I was naked, I was hungry, I was in prison. Are we getting the point yet? No, haven't. Now it's going to repeat all 4 times again. You're not going in because when I was naked, when I was hungry. And they repeat the whole thing all over again. When did we not see you naked? It's like, can I make this any clearer to you? And yet, as Christians, I have to say, it's hard to get people to go and visit others in hospital. We hardly ever see people in jail. We do share with the hungry, but not that much. And Jesus here, with his pedantic repetition, he's saying, this is who, if you are following me, you have to be people of compassion. And this is very much underscored here, because in Matthew's Gospel, if you see the position of this in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 25, what comes after this in Matthew's Gospel is the Passion. What comes before this, as we have been journeying through the whole green season of the church, is Jesus' ministry. All the parables he's told, all the healings that he's done. And this is the end of that journey, just before he's going to his Passion. And he says here, Matthew has this position here, as if to sum up all of his ministry, draw in all of those cords and threads into this scene of the King of Glory, and before he goes to the cross. So it's giving us an interpretation of why Jesus is going to the cross. It's sometimes worthwhile just to pause for a moment and realize that for Christians, that question of why did he go to the cross, the early Christians, was quite confusing. It took 3 centuries of debates between different parts of the church before we reached what we have in the Nicene Creed about what we understand who Jesus was. At that time, they weren't sure. Why does the descendant of David, who's meant to be a glorious emperor, like George Washington would be to this country, why does he go and get capital punishment at the end of his life? It's very confusing to them. For we are smaller brothers, younger brothers and sisters to the Jews. If you were to sit around with rabbis for a little while and hear them speak about the Hebrew Scriptures, it will make your head spin how much they know and understand about what's in the Hebrew Scriptures. The scenes in different people's lives, what this could mean, what Rabbi so-and-so said. You'd be amazed and breathtaking, and you think, well, how can it possibly be that we think we know more than they do? We don't. But there's one difference that we have in the New Testament, in this particular interpretation of what happens in the Hebrew Scriptures. In the Hebrew Scriptures you have, as we had in the first reading, from the book of Ezekiel, it refers to the coming of the Messiah. And the Messiah is meant to be a conquering general. He's meant to come like George Washington. He's meant to come to establish the nation. He's meant to come to draw them back from all over the world. It's meant to be a moment of triumph. That's the Messiah. Then on the other hand, you have the suffering servant. For Jewish rabbis, the suffering servant is a completely different figure from the Messiah. They're not the same person. For Jewish rabbis, the suffering servant could be about the children of Israel because they've suffered so much. Or it could be about one of the prophets who is suffering, like Isaiah. But it's not about the Messiah. For Christians, we take the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 52 to 53, the suffering servant, and the Messiah to be the same individual. We weave those two things together. And that is the difference of the New Testament's interpretation. And you see that here in this parable about Jesus. He's coming as the King of glory, but he says, what kind of king is he coming as? He's coming as a king who is grateful for the fact that people have clothed him. That's an unusual kind of king. He's coming as a king who is grateful to his subjects for having given him food, given him clothing, come and seen him when he's sick. You see, it's a very different kind of a king. And he's saying, unless we are those kind of followers of his, we are not part of his kingdom. I'd like to just share with you something that, as I read the gospel this morning, read it out in the first service, it suddenly struck me. And it may be controversial to you, and I don't mean it to be controversial, but it suddenly struck me that why with this reading, read it again. Just read over this gospel reading again. Don't you think this gospel reading could apply to immigrants? In the name of Christ. Amen.